And I hate the word serious art still, so, you know. I don't want to do serious art, I want to do art. And I don't know where it comes in, that kind of thing, but serious art can mean really deadly, boring, over-pretentious rubbish. Yeah, it's slow art, really, you see, because I think people have my pictures and it takes them a long while probably to get right through to the bottom of it or the end of it, but maybe there isn't an end of it. But, you know, it isn't an instant grab. I mean, it doesn't kind of click and then it's all over. It's actually something people have to kind of engage with. I would say it's a kind of conversation, really, and I set up all sorts of ideas in the pictures which lead to things, I hope, and lead to thoughts. Because my work is really domestic, most of it is sold for people to have in their houses, and I like that because I think it's a way that people then live with your idea and they get a long time and a sort of just little tiny fragments every day perhaps, you know, noticing something, and then it sort of gradually builds and it goes through generations too. It's like I always tell the story that I've been in the business really because I graduated in 1967 from the Royal College of Art. So I have people who bought work a very long while ago and they have children and even grandchildren who come and say, well, I used to have this picture when I was little and I loved it, you know, and I grew up with it. Most of the stuff that appears in my pictures is from memories of either other pictures or films or books or people I've met. I absorb things. I'm a sponge for all kinds of ideas and different things. When I've got them, I kind of process them, but I don't really do it very consciously. I actually just have it inside me. So I do find things appearing which are really very deeply buried. And I don't know why I kept them in my mind and why they impressed me. And that's really kind of fascinating because you keep plunging back through things. But it's not just the past, it is the present. I mean, I'm getting things all the time now through travel and through meeting people, and living in London I think is amazing because you just walk down the street and you meet somebody or you hear of somebody speaking in another language and in another way and doing things in a different way, dressing in a different way. All those kind of things I think are really very important to me. My father was in the printing trade, and when I was very young, there's one thing that I was the luckiest kid in my school because my dad brought back loads and loads of paper home, just blank paper. So we're talking after the Second World War. Paper was very scarce, really. And so all the kids at school had these tiny little notebooks if they did any drawings or paintings in. And I had reams of huge sheets of paper, so I did big drawings all over the place. And I really enjoyed that process of drawing. So that was, I think, from then on, you know, I wanted to draw all the time. I didn't know that I'd become an artist. I didn't know what an artist was. But I knew I was passionate about telling stories through pictures. I did feel quite alienated from all sorts of the way I thought people were. And I couldn't understand how other people saw things or expressed things or felt about things. I mean, it probably was the kind of area I lived in was very boring, really. Everybody hid everything. It was the suburbia. South London. I mean, it's not the same now, but then I think in British society it was 95% white British. We had very few people who came from anywhere else. We all had very set ideas and we all kind of watched the same TV programs, laughed at the same jokes, spoke in the same accent. It was completely kind of a monoculture. But I didn't quite know where I was in it. And I think actually partly that's why I wanted to draw, because I could actually sort of find something that was my own. I didn't feel part of the generality, but I think everybody was wearing a mask. And then I found that there was a thing called theatre, where people go and pretend to be somebody else. It really intrigued me, the idea that somebody could be something else, or you could experience something else, that there was something else. It was the beginning of quite a sort of important understanding of something beyond what I knew. You know, I began to see glimpses of all sorts of things in the distance, which I was very fascinated by. I went to art school in 1959. Nobody could conceive of the idea of anybody having a career as an artist. I mean, you could be an applied artist, you could be a designer perhaps, a graphic designer, or, I mean, it was something in that line. My art school training was very basic. Not basic, it was very old-fashioned in a way. It was life drawing, composition, landscape painting, modelling, calligraphy, typography, a little bit of printmaking, all those things which were sort of traditional skills that artists learned, the craft of, so you learnt the technique. That's what art school was about in those days, not so much about ideas. Nowadays you have art schools which they don't bother too much with technique, they just discuss ideas, get people to kind of think of the most crazy things they can. We weren't really taught that, were we? We were taught that, you know, there were very definitely things you had to learn, whether it was colour, form, composition, perspective, all those things. Art which sort of just depended on language, or art which depended upon kind of ideas and actions, performance art, and nothing against any of these things, but what I'm saying is they are sort of slightly kind of on the side of what I see as very central, which is the visual experience and the expression of something you've absorbed as a visual experience as you as a person, and now you need skills for that, both in looking and in kind of making. And those skills are difficult to acquire if you don't have any training in them. You can't just kind of pick them off a shelf or off a book or off a YouTube video. I still think the actual practicality of going into a workshop or working in a studio with an artist who helps you, which is what art schools did. They tried to train you to do things which they knew how to do. So it was a passing on of information, you know, a passing on of skills, which I think was really important. And I've done lots of things about theatre. It's been a big subject for me from very early on. And so I've always had friends who've been actors. And I do think actually acting is probably the highest form of art, even when it's done well, of course. You know, it's almost the supreme thing because it is the artifice of yourself to become somebody else. I'm afraid I'm always struggling, you know, because I'm just making a picture. So however much I put into it, I never actually make myself something else. I make myself a picture. In that sense, it's slightly a lesser art, it seems to me, than the highest form of acting. I suppose one of the other big influences for me was actually sound, because voice, because we had radio, but not very much television. And then television was very audio in its early days. You know, you had guys who were doing comedy who would just sit there and talk to each other. That was the comedy. You know, it wasn't really not much moving and not much visual in it, really, basically. Might be a bit in the facial expression. But basically it was sound, and it was about words and jokes and puns and all those kind of things. And I realised, of course, also that the best comedy was also very serious. I suppose that coincided with my view about the mask and about the people and putting on things and not putting things on, that, you know, everything actually is quite tragic. So actually people sort of always had this kind of mask on, and behind that there was probably some rather awful things going on. And they would make jokes about them as well, but they didn't ever really reveal the tragedy. There's something about comedy and drama and acting and all those things which are very interlinked. There were things that people never said when I was young. I mean, whether it was about sex or anything else, you know, but now you can say some things but not other things. So I think there's always like something you can't say, you know, and you couldn't mention it at all before, but now you can't be. You've got to be very inclusive and you've got to be very careful what you say. There has been this kind of change, and I suppose it's partly awareness, and of course it's very good that we, you know, I grew up in, I think, I was thinking about it the other day, I grew up basically in a kind of racist, sexist, homophobic kind of society. And, you know, they were ingrained in you and in your language and in everything that you did. So actually becoming aware of that and not doing that is very good. I'm not saying, you know, a world where you can say anything and do anything like that. Why I think it was so suppressed and why people were wearing the masks was because of all those sort of taboos that we had. And we couldn't actually kind of learn to recognise that people were different or whatever else it was. So the mask and the drawing and all those kind of things somehow weave into the same subject. And now that one's in much more kind of what seems to be much more liberal times, but not entirely, because there are lots of things you can't say or do or whatever. But some of the changes have been very good. So we live in a much better age in that respect. And I suppose my work has had to evolve and come to terms with that. You can't do the same things as you could before, you know. Comedians have to change their routines, don't they? I probably had a fairly ordinary life, so all my material is quite ordinary. I've never had, you know, I didn't come from a kind of rich background where there was a huge amount of stimulus or anything else. So the ordinary and the everyday was quite important. But I think that is important, and I think, you know, the common objects and the common scene is a very kind of key issue. My favourite film, got the most stars in my kind of pantheon, is Monsieur Hulot's Holiday by Jacques Tati. It's the most ordinary film, but it's the funniest. Nothing really happens. It's a series of rolling gags of a sort of guy going on holiday in the seaside. It's made in, I think, 1959. And it just absolutely, to my mind, it's sublime because nothing happens. It's very ordinary, but it's extraordinary. And the acting by Jacques Tati, who's sort of in that kind of Hollywood sort of Keaton, Marx Brothers kind of, that kind of slapstick kind of thing. He does absolutely beautifully. And it just is, it's wonderful. So, you know, that's an inspiration by seeing somebody do something with the ordinary. I didn't really enjoy the Oppenheimer film anyway, but before were all these bloody trailers. And they're all explosions and people flying through the air and killing each other. And I thought, I'm not in the slightest bit interested in one single part of that. Cinema had to be spectacular. I don't think it does. I think it has to be very amazingly kind of perceptive and careful, and then wonderful things can happen in it. And some of the greatest art is in cinema, there's no question. I think I'm always looking. The word voyeur has obviously got bad connotations. It's interpreted to be predatory. But in a way you do take things. I think one of the things I've always said to artists, young artists, is you're robbers, really, basically. What you go around is stealing things that you see. You don't actually physically take them, you take them in your mind. And that's an act of kind of robbery in some senses. And sometimes you might see something that's a bit private. And see, I've got a picture on the wall there which is about kind of voyeurism. But that is a New York picture which I did after being in an apartment in New York on a day when I couldn't go out drawing. So I drew from within the apartment, and I was looking across, and I could see all these windows with people sitting, typing or ironing or kind of, you know, having a meal or whatever else. And I realised that I was looking at them in their private world and taking something from them. But it seemed legitimate. And when I came back and made the print there, I didn't copy anything that I actually saw. I made it all up. But that inspiration was really from Hitchcock's Rear Window. Yeah. You know, the idea, I think a filmmaker is very much like, in that sense, a voyeur and a robber of kind of things that you see, which you make into something which is entertainment or whatever you call it, you know. So I think looking and taking is part of the business, yeah. Well, you see, I'm so from that analogue age that, you know, I mean, obviously, 50s, 60s, even the 70s, we had no computers, we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have any of those things. So we were all rooted in that knowledge, which all our learning, all our education in a way was through analogue means. And then along comes the kind of new things, and they rapidly develop. And of course you can see fantastic virtues in them. You know, I mean, there are great kind of things. We could never have believed how communicative we can be, how much we can mix all sorts of things together. So I think it's a fabulous world. I'm not somebody who wants to just stay in that past, but all my training and all my thinking and all my kind of personality is in that past. And I do think actually that something in that is quintessentially something that people have to go on having. They can't become entirely analog. They can't be avatars. They can't have their brains replaced with AI. They have to think, and they have to feel, and they have to use their hands, and they have to be able to walk and to move. Otherwise, they become zombies. And there is a danger they become zombies, I think. Yeah. When you make a picture, it doesn't work properly, really. However much you kid yourself, there's always something that you haven't done absolutely right. I mean, if you thought that it was absolutely right, I think you should give up. So I think that it's about dissatisfaction. And I think a bit like mistakes, I think dissatisfaction is the way you learn, the way you progress. Because if you were satisfied, you're just a smug bastard, you know, you're not going to kind of get anywhere. Miserable, smug. So you have to kind of think, yes, there's something more. And I don't force it, but I do think always, the reason I make another picture is because I know the other one wasn't right. And there was something, it may be small or it may be big. And also, I suppose there's a issue when you look back at work, when you've been working for a long while. You go back to 1967, as I said, I've got that work, examples of that work. And you look at it and you think, well, hey, did I do that? And you know, of course, physically your whole body has changed and your mind's changed and your personality probably has developed. But then you did it, and you can see the links with what you do now. But what do you think about it? Do you think it's any good? I think it's curious and quaint sometimes, and I sometimes quite like them. But actually, you know, the work I'm doing at this moment is the key thing. And the work that I will do is the next most important thing. Overworked lots of things. You're prone to do it, you know, put in too much. But editing, keeping things back, not filling something, not taking something to the nth degree, changing something a little bit, just holding back is quite difficult. Certainly one of the things I criticise myself for, you know, not being absolutely, not that good at finishing, not very good at starting sometimes either, but, you know, I get kind of either so obsessed by the idea that I work it to death, which you can do, and then you can kill it completely by kind of overworking it, or else I underwork it, and I've done that as well. You see, when you have that, so there's always this kind of balancing, going from one side to another. One moment you're doing it one way, and then, oh, I've done that too much, you know. I do love doing things which are very free, you see, and then I love doing things that are very tight. And so I sometimes oscillate between these sort of different things, don't always get it right. It's a big problem. All the drawing books are about trying to resolve how something is, how you want it. And sometimes you can get it in the preparatory idea really beautifully because you didn't really care. A bit back to your point about not trying too hard. I didn't try too hard, so I did something and it looks all right. Then you go to put it into an image and you work it a bit more and you get a bit more worried about it and it's not as good as the one in there. And that's a bit worrying. But printmaking actually sometimes allows you to do a lot of different clever techniques, like take things from an early drawing and sort of translate it through the process. So actually painting is a bit more acute, more acutely a problem, but printmaking has got lots of tricks of the trade which you can use. The studio is like an extension of your brain. You know, this is my brain box. So it's got my bits and pieces, but not just the artifacts, but it's the space where you can think. You know, you dare to imagine something, again, in the protected space, which is the studio. And then you can make something which you can take out, which you can show to people if you're confident enough with it. So the studio is kind of a crucial element, I think, for most artists. I know there are some artists who claim they don't need the studio, but I don't quite believe it, you know. Question here, which I mean is back to the AI and digital thing, which is, of course, you can do amazing reproductions now. When I was young, reproductive runs of like posters or whatever else, quite complicated and expensive to make. Now, of course, we've all got machines that do it. I mean, it's a bit like everybody's got a video camera, still camera, you know, and everybody, millions and trillions of photographs are taken and films are made, videos are made. Then I'm sure you agree, 99.9 of them are absolute rubbish. As films, I mean, they're useful for other purposes. But so now you can reproduce anything beautifully, facsimile. You can virtually do it, or you can do it almost in 3D, you know. You can make something absolutely a facsimile of another thing. So the reproductive thing is completely kind of what many people now think art is. And I think actually there's something back to the analog argument. I think things have been made directly by the artist, even if they're digital. I can take digital art if it's really made by somebody and they've really influenced and controlled it. But when it's simply handed over to somebody else to make a digital reproduction, that is not the original, it's diluted. So I believe in the kind of directness of printmaking by the artist. That's what we call original printmaking, which is perhaps a sort of contradiction in terms, because by fact it's a multiple, it's not really an original, but it's a sort of a series of originals, but it's made by the artist. See, I don't think art is a virtue. There's good art and there's bad art, obviously, but you know, it's sort of so difficult to classify that, isn't it? Because I think it's to do with the context and the times. I think there's a reality too, in the democratic sense of what actually people respond to, which is where I think very close with the comedian and probably less with the sort of very fine actor, because I think the comedian who goes around a club has to get the audience and has to communicate and has to judge the audience. Whereas I think the very serious actor just does their serious acting, whatever the weather, you know, they just kind of project it in. And I think there's something about the dialogue which is making things for people. It was a period of time when I think I wanted to be taken more seriously. And I think people thought, I think I once had some criticism of a show. Somebody said, oh, it's just like schoolboy kind of jokes and it's just humour. You know, they sort of implied that what I was doing wasn't really serious art. And I hate the word serious art still. So, you know, I mean, I don't want to do serious art, I want to do art. And I don't know where it comes in, that kind of thing, but serious art can mean really deadly, boring, over-pretentious rubbish, to my mind, as much as, you know, comedy could be completely lightweight and meaningless. I absolutely understand that. It's not automatically one thing or the other, but it's kind of trying to find your own level and trying to find those things that you weave together. So to me, the funny is close to the dramatic, and it's kind of, they're very closely entwined. So actually people laughing are on the verge of tears, aren't they, you see? So.